Hello, this is Kathy Beatty with Divorce Support Anonymous, and I have a guest with me today that I am excited for you to hear the information that she brings to us, because as we go through divorce and we go into mediation, we do have to negotiate, and many of us are not good negotiators. We don't stand up for ourselves well, and if you are thinking, well, I've already been through the divorce and it's really not an issue for me, we always need to be able to negotiate. And this is a skill that if you haven't had before, you're going to need it as you go through divorce, but you're also going to need it as you proceed into the single life. So my guest this morning, we have with us Penny Rosema. She is a professional who has worked in Fortune 500 companies in negotiations. She has spent over 25 years in a manufacturing operation leadership roles. She's a founder and CEO of Two Views International, which provides coaching and workshops on effective negotiation for manufacturing, retail, and B2B. A graduate of Michigan State University, she is an engineer with her MBA from the University of Notre Dame. So she's obviously very bright, but she's also very warm and wonderful. So good morning and welcome, Penny.
Kathy, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So as I consider folks going through divorce, I realize, we've got to get some skills in this area. And as I stated in the introduction, not only through the divorce, but after the divorce, many of my viewers are women who do not negotiate, do not know how to negotiate. Not to say that's true of all of them. Some of them are much better than men. And there's men also who don't know how to negotiate, how to stand up for themselves. So I have some questions that I would love for you to give us some skills in this area. First of all, how do you keep your emotions out of negotiation when there is a lot of pain, frustration, anger, and bad feelings toward the one you are negotiating with?
Kathy, that's an interesting question. And thank you for letting me think about some of these questions ahead of time, because I want to kind of qualify that when I speak to it, I will refer to it as how I talk to people when they're doing a business negotiation. But it occurs to me as I follow through with it, and especially with your opening, it really applies to everything. The examples that I give might be business examples, but I think people will be able to quickly, transfer those to their personal negotiations as well. In a business negotiation, if there is someone that is a big struggle, that we know there's a personality between us, one of the first things we do is there someone else that can step in for the face-to-face conversations? It doesn't, if I was the buyer of that commodity, it didn't have to be me. I might choose to bring in, a teammate from quality assurance because maybe their personalities fit better, or it would be easier for them to speak to each other. And then at a minimum in a business negotiation, we would bring in more than one person. Okay. So again, I'm talking about some, a real high profile conflict, and the value of, body language and tone, not only for what the other person was saying, but for how I speak. You started here a little bit about, sometimes people don't advocate for themselves, and having a feeling of that I'm not a good negotiator can be a disadvantage to someone. However, being very aggressive, which is my challenge, I'm not afraid to negotiate. I'll go in there and fight. That can also be a disadvantage. And then having someone that can give you some feedback on, the tone, how loud you were, how much you talked, how much you listened, can be very helpful. The other little insight that I've had on both my personal negotiations, I would say, and my professional ones, is something I call let go of the rope. Sometimes we are so tied up in the conversation or the issue that we just are pulling hard on it. And I have found that if I just let go of the rope, step away from it, it doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean giving in, but just start to look for the things that you agree on. Those are a couple of suggestions I have for when you're in a really tough negotiation, especially when there's hard feelings or potentially you're bringing baggage to the negotiation.
Yes, and there is a lot of baggage when you go into domestic mediation, for sure. Excuse me. And the necessity of realizing, you state that you work in the business, and when we go into mediation, we have to have that business mindset that this is a business transaction, which is really difficult when you're looking across the table at someone who you have been intimate with for so many years. So it is a mindset. And that's what I hear you saying, whether it's business or in mediation or dealing with them after the divorce or just being a single person, of looking at this without emotions is so important. And speaking without emotions is so important. So tell me this, is mediation a mental game, and how do you prepare for it?
Yes, I do believe it's a mental game, and the word prepare is the key statement that you have. So I believe, and what I learned through my experience in negotiating contracts for international companies and multi-million-dollar projects, is to have a strategic process and to follow it. Those are two important things. And sometimes I would imagine in the case of a divorce mediation, you really need to have some outside resources. Don't try and do this alone, right? It takes a teamwork to do it. For us as a business negotiation, there were 4 key initial strategies in that preparation. And we created a strategy wish list. That would be anything that would improve the outcome of the agreement for us. Every possible thing that we could wish for. If I was working with IT professionals, they might say, well, what would you really like to get out of this deal? They'd say, well, I want it for free. Well, that would be nice. However, if we can't get it for free, what kind of things might be nice? And then we would create this list of all the things that we valued, right? And that might include, some warranty work or quality control letters or someone to help onboard the system, those kind of things. And quite honestly, there might be a lot of things that we really would like that would mean a lot to us and cost them very little. So you're looking for every possible thing on that strategy wish list. This is just the preparation, and this is for your eyes only. We don't share it with anybody. It's just something that we had in hand. Second thing was alternatives. What are we going to do if we don't come to an agreement? And you have to plan for that initially. The third thing was the target goal. What does a reasonable agreement look like? That sweet spot we were looking for is, what do we estimate they will think is a great deal? What is their walk away? Where are they going to dig in their heels? And where will they go, oh, wow, this was fantastic. And we estimate this area, there's always a sweet spot, right? It's not entirely, I don't get it for free. And they're not entirely getting their highest price they could ever ask anybody to pay for it. But there's somewhere in between where there's lots of things that make it a sweet deal for us. And that would be including all those items on that wish list. And then the last one that's really important, I felt, and we used all the time in our strategic planning, was assumptions. What assumptions do we have about them? And are they true? Test them, validate them. What assumptions do they have about me? Test them. And I'm finishing a book, Kathy, actually, later this year. I'll be publishing it. And in there, I share a story, which is one you can look up on Google, type in a CNN reporter and the pilot, and you'll see this story. But basically what it was is the CNN reporter was going to be doing photographs on a fire out in, I think it was California. And so his upline approved a pilot for him. He gets to the airport, stops at the hangar. There's a plane out there running on the same time he was supposed to meet it. He jumps in the plane takes off, and the CNN photographer says to the pilot, okay, I want you to swing down by here and get as close as you can on this side of the hill to that fire. And the pilot says, what for? He goes, well, because I'm a photographer and this is where I'm supposed to be getting my shots. And then the pilot says, oh, so you're not my training coach? He was, my brain is skipping me right now, but he was the pilot. He was in training, and that was his coach that was coming on. He thought, don't make assumptions, right? You have assumptions, and some of them are going to be wrong. Always test them. So the recap was a strategy list. Definitely know what your alternatives are if you don't come to an agreement. What is your target goal? And estimate theirs as well. Try and find that sweet spot. And then write down all of your assumptions. Now, the other thing that we did, which I think is very important, is think about what your counterpart is assuming about you, because some of them might be wrong, right? And if you want to know what their assumptions are, a simple way to do is just ask. In a business segment, we might ask, what are you assuming about, what our flexibility is with pricing, right? Ask, write down all your assumptions, validate them, and you can check with your network, you can check with other people, but there's lots of ways to test your assumptions. That's my big planning recommendation.
That's excellent to work in mediation or any negotiation that we're having. That preparation and the wish list, I love. I actually do something similar in working with people and telling them put in one column what it is that you want, in the middle what you don't care, you're ambiguous about. If you get it, great. If not, that's fine too. And the third, what you don't want. But this is much more specific of the assumptions. And the person that you're mediating with, so you probably know you can assume some things. However, a divorce gets really wacky, and people who you assume do one thing can do the other. But I love that. So preparation.
And Kathy, one thing I'm including in my book are some forms at the end of it. And I go through a step with people that is like brainstorm first, just write down everything, just wild, hairy, crary. And then, like you said, the next step is, okay, put it in a column. What is the wish? What's the rationale? Why is it so important to you? Or why do you think it's so important to them? And then, ranking them in the order of it, what's most important to me. What's the things I will, nice to have versus what is a must have. So it's very interesting and fun to follow that we're on the same wavelength.
Yeah, absolutely. And your final one about the assumptions, to validate them. This is really, that would be key. I had not thought of that before. So you've got your attorney to do those assumptions with, or you have maybe a family member or a friend who you can sit down and say, here's what I'm thinking. Again, they're not going to direct you, but you can, as you hear yourself speaking, you're going to help yourself get clarity on that, I think. So love it. Other than mental preparation, what else should we prepare for negotiating?
So there were three things that kind of came from mind. Three or four. I will see what you think of the first three, and then I'll go on. The first one is the power of reciprocity. Think about when you walk into a building and there's an airlock, right? And you open the first door for somebody. Often they'll open the second door for you. There's just this kind of law of nature that if you give something, I'll give something. That's why the wish list is so important. That if you have something and they come to you for a concession, this is in a business standpoint I'm talking about, because I don't have the process that you use in mediation, but they come to you and then they're asking for a negotiation. The first thing I teach people to say, or a concession, the first thing I teach people to say is, there may be a path to that. It's never no. I mean, even if I know it's going to be no, I never say that. So it's like, well, there'll be a path to that. Then I look to my wish list and I say, okay, they're asking for this concession. What would be an equivalent, something that means a lot to me? And it doesn't have to mean a lot to them. It just has to be of high value for me. And I've got it rated on my wish list. So I ask for a similar value of a concession from them. So that's the power of reciprocity. The other thing that I talk about in preparation often is beware of bully tactics. They are absolutely a red flag. As soon as somebody starts pushing for a deadline or, any other kind of bully tactics, I take it as it's a flag. There's something that they want to distract you from, and they're, pushing on a bully tactic to use it. I guess that's kind of a combination in my second one there. And then the third one is as deadlines. If you're tempted to use them yourself, use them sparingly. They lead to irrational behavior, and only use them if they really, really are a constraint to you. Your counterpart will see them as desperation. You also will be viewed as being bullying. And if you don't enforce it, let me give you a perfect example. We were negotiating for resort space for the association that I worked for before, I retired. And they, deadline, hey, we have to have an answer by such and such a date. And my restrictions with the board and what was available, we just didn't have an answer for them. And so we said, okay, we pass. And in that particular instance, it had to do with COVID. And we had made a $3,000 deposit, and then they said, that's great, but we got to set a new date for when the next event is going to happen. And we were trying to get to that next event date, and we just couldn't meet their timing. They threw a deadline out there and said, that's it. We got to have an answer. We said, okay, we're letting it go. 3 days later, they called back and said, well, we could. But we said no, because we viewed that they were very desperate for money. They set out a fake deadline there. Our assumption is it was all driven by financials. It just put up a bunch of red flags for us. And so we just decided we didn't want to deal with them, and we were willing to leave that $3,000 on the table for it. So, to repeat, there's power in reciprocity. Beware of those red flags where somebody's it could be personal attacks when they're bullying you. Again, those are red flags. Those are not negotiating attributes, I would say. And then, false deadlines.
I love those. Unfortunately, with sometimes in mediation, you have the court who has imposed a deadline that you have to work within. So, but if they are false deadlines, and then the value of walking away. I know when I bought my last car, I wanted them to come down $1,000. They said no. I walked away, and then they called me and said, "Yep, you can have it for that." So, I think we get into that about how to know when it's time to walk away, which is just incredibly important. Okay, how can I use silence powerfully in negotiations?
I love talking about this one because it's so darn hard for me. If you're if you're a very quiet, introverted person, this is probably your niche. This is your sweet spot. For me, it's really hard. It's also very hard if you're a person that runs your own business. You're in control. You make the decisions. In the business world, it can be very difficult if you're the CEO, if you're the manager of because you want to show your power in your decision making. But there's so much power in silence. Another reason why we like to, in the preparation, I always talk about know what you bring to the table. So it might be different in a mediation that you're dealing with, but from a professional standpoint, what our pricing, what our quality is, if we're on the sales side of it, for an example. Because let's take an example of a buyer. They will always say to you, I can get the same thing cheaper. Right. And it hurts, and they can, but if you've done your homework ahead and your product and what you bring to the table, you can respond with, is it the same quality? Is it the same delivery? Can you get it on time? Do they have warranties? Those kind of things. So you would ask an open-ended question and then be quiet. That's really tough. I have a kind of a more universal response, because an answer might be, help me understand why you think that request is reasonable.
I love that question.
Because now they have to give a defense for where they're at. And then an example that I have of a very, very powerful work of silence for just a very short period of time, because it doesn't have to be days or weeks. A copywriter that I was coaching put in a quote for someone that called for them to do a copyright for an article. And it involved interviewing in an area that she had a lot of experience in. And when she gave them the price, they can't do that. No, there's just no way. We never pay that much for it. And she said, well, here's the reason why, here's my level of experience. Here's what I bring to the table, my experience with interviewing. And that's the reasoning for the pricing. And then she just was very, very quiet. And the woman talked about, we can't do that. She stayed silent. She didn't respond to any of the, well, why they can't. Finally, she said, well, I could do some checking and I'll call you back. She circled back, email, I believe it was, a short time later and said, yes, we'll pay you. And it was a 25% more just for being quiet, and she wrote back and said, thank you very much. I'm more than happy to work for someone that values the experience that's brought to the table, some very gracious response to her. So just not saying anything. Now, if you're really tempted to speak, you can bite your lip, bite your cheek. You can say, oh, excuse me, I need a bathroom break, or I need a cup of coffee, but just anything to, step away from the table if you find that you can't be silent there is very helpful too. But if you can stay eye to eye contact with them, ask an open-ended question and then shut up, you get lots of information.
Wow, I love that. That would come in so handy when you are in mediation. And you also at any time have caucus. So it's like time out. I want a break, which will give them time to think and you time to think as well. How cool is that? How can I decide plan B? And you did speak to that a little bit, but how can I decide plan B when necessary in negotiations? So it'd be nice if you could get everything you want in mediation, but it doesn't happen. So how do you prepare for, or how do you decide when it's time to go for plan B?
So yes, there should be a plan B and a plan C if you have possible. So I encourage list every alternative that you have. And if you use like a car example, sometimes I say, well, okay, let's say you are starting a brand new job on Monday, and on Saturday at 3 noon, your car breaks down, and you go to a car dealership and you've got a car, time's a ticking. They're not open on Sunday. You got to do something this afternoon, and it's not a deal that you want. And you would say, well, I don't have any other alternatives. Well, I do this sometimes in a workshop. I say, okay, well, let's think about what the alternatives are. Do you really need a car on Monday? Yeah, I know it's a new job and everything, but do you have a neighbor? Is there somebody else that works there? Is there public transportation? Can you rent a car, lease a car for a day? So you always have alternatives, even again, just for a short time, like you walked away for a few hours. So that's why you have your list of alternatives, your A, B, C plans, and even now Uber, and all those other alternatives. Yes, because when you're in the negotiation, there's all these emotions that are going through you, anxiety. Sometimes it's that you just really want it so bad, and you will say yes right away when you really shouldn't. And the reason the A, B, C, and how many alternatives most you can list are important is you never want to accept something that is worth less than one of those alternatives. That would just be stupid. But you get caught up in the moment, and maybe you've put some money towards something, or you've kind of committed to something. Maybe it's your reputation. I said I'd never take. Just stop and think, because you might be actually harming yourself, doing something worse to yourself than if you, accepted an alternative. And you don't want to accept an offer that's in your best interest. And doing nothing, again, is always an alternative. So does that help a little bit?
It does help a little bit. Yes. If you feel pressured, and I always try to make sure that people do not feel pressured in mediation, we can come back to another day. We can give it some time if necessary. So I love that.
And Kathy, we talk about how people might even be doing that, like their own personal negotiations, and you might, when you talk about that, feeling that pressure, it can be as simple as, oh, just a second, I got to call you back. Let's say it's on a phone call. Go in the bathroom. I've done this before, and talk to yourself in the mirror. Well, Penny, is this really that great of a, just to bring something to settle it down. And then, you can come back to the conversation and loosen up that emotion a little bit.
I love that. I love that. So when do we know we need to settle instead of continuing to fight? That's a tough one.
It is a very tough one. And I think there's more emotion in it when you're working with the type of negotiations that you're dealing with. Although you can carry baggage into business negotiations as well. But before I would settle, I would make sure I took a break. I took a breath. I reached out to somebody else. For us, it could, business situation, it could be a mentor, it could be your sourcing strategy team. It could be a coach that you have. It could be your neighbor. If it's a personal negotiation, someone that you trust that you can talk to. And I often recommend doing a reverse role play. When you do a reverse role play and I take the position of you and you take, now I'm thinking like you're going to be thinking, and that kind of breaks things up and will help give you a better perspective of it. But the final thing is, and this is why preparation is so important, because only you can decide what a successful negotiation is. And quite frankly, if we got together and had similar negotiations and you negotiated to a certain point, if you did your homework and you were prepared, you knew your alternatives, you knew what, you've documented what your assumptions were, you tested them as best you could, you never have all the information you want. But if you did your homework and I decided what a great goal was for you and what a great deal looked like, and you were anywhere in that parameter, it's a great deal for you. I can't come along and say to you, well, I could have done better than that. I don't have the same constraints as you. I don't have the same emotions as you. I don't, so what's so important about the preparation is you almost determine ahead of time where your success point is. And you've done the best you can because you prepared and you planned.
Right. And in mediation, there's a lot to be said to having it done.
Yes.
And to
moving on.
To move forward. Absolutely. So many people go in with this, and this is just an impromptu question, but many people go in with this steel mind and don't have the flexibility or the creativity, which is where the mediator role comes in. We get a little creative in the process, but speak to those people who, I'm going in, this is what I'm getting, and I've got this determined in my head and nothing's going to stop me.
That's an interesting that you say that, because a similarity that I see in business is there are times when you're the heavy. I think of GM. Back when we were negotiating at the corporation that I worked for, it was in the, I think, late 90s. I'm not exactly sure, but they were requiring all of their suppliers to give them double-digit reductions every year. Yeah, that's it. Like, I remember thinking, wow, how does that work? Well, you can do changes in your manufacture and find efficiencies and stuff, but there's a limit. And I always felt like I wanted my suppliers to be successful. If they were successful, I was going to be successful. In that similarity, I see that, especially in a divorce, you have some ongoing relationships that you're going to have to talk to these people long-term. How do you want that to work? Now, in a business side of it, but fast forward a few years, suppliers quit supplying to them because they just couldn't afford it anymore. They changed their operations and supplied a different industry. Some of them, just the only way they could continue to cut costs is to cut corners. The quality of the product went down, and GM eventually filed bankruptcy. Now, I can't tell you that there's an exact correlation to that, but I sure scratch my head and say, I don't know if that was such a good idea. Second example was when I was working with the cookware manufacturers, and I did a lot of understanding of what was going on in the retail business. So the cookware manufacturers, think of cast iron and, all clad, Lodge cast iron, like we said, it's tough with the retail buyers to get shelf space. The retail buyers, they really have control. They kind of determine, what's going to happen when and where, until COVID hit. And overnight, everything was shut down. They were turning to their suppliers going, oh, can you help me? Can we delay the shipments? Can we delay the payments? We don't know what's going on. Relationships matter. I don't care if it's in a divorce, if it's in business, and even if you've got full-fledged, you've got all the leverage, and you can tell the other side what they can do and when they can do it. That doesn't last forever. And when it changes, it's not when you foresee it and you can do any preparation. Relationships matter. And I would argue they matter in everything. And I'm not saying that there aren't, some bully situations that have to be managed differently in mediation, but I think you should try to work together wherever you can.
I think that is so valuable. You're absolutely right. Relationships matter. They're going to go through drastic change, but they matter. And if you can go through this mediation with integrity and planning and that right mindset, you're going to make it. You're going to be okay.
Yeah. And I would say you even, whether it's business or it's, personal relationships, you have to have boundaries, right? You can't take abuse. You can't, be pushed. You have to have excessive boundaries, but I liked your word integrity and respect, and not the vengeful side of it. I can do this just because I can, is not going to serve you in the end. It's not a pretty look.
No, it certainly is not. So Penny, with your vast experience in the past, you're busy, very busy right now. What is it that you're up to today?
I'm finishing a book on negotiations, and it's a business book, a kind of a niche for I say women 25 to 45, but really, like you mentioned earlier, anybody that wants to learn more about negotiations. And, I have a whole stack of books here behind me that are on negotiation. There's plenty of them out there for people. This is just a simple step by step. Do this, do this. Here's a form. Here's how you brainstorm. Now put it in order, and some short stories with it to say how, this applies and why it makes sense. That's going to be coming out later this year. And then I have some podcasts. I'm putting out a number of podcasts that are doing the same thing, just telling people the story. So they can find me on pennyrosema.com if they're interested in it. And there's always a way to get a hold of me too. I love conversations.
This has been delightful and so needed when we are going into negotiations, whether that's for a car, now that we're single, or going through mediation. We do have to have that business mindset. We do have to have a plan. We do have to have some good conversation with our support. And typically that's going to be your attorney. However, some people go through divorce without their attorney. This skill is critically important for you. And I'm amazed at how many people actually do not know how to stand up for themselves. As I work with folks in support groups and in coaching, it's very, very important that you learn that skill for now and for later.
Yeah.
Penny Rosema with Two Views. This has been delightful, necessary, and I thank you so much for your work. And I know your work is total integrity, and your influence of helping people negotiate, whether it's big business deals or individuals. You contribute greatly, and I appreciate you.
Kathy, it's always a delight to talk with you. You have a great day.
Thanks. You too.